My name is Cassidy Holt, and I'm 29 years old. Last Thanksgiving, my father stood up in front of nearly 36 family members and punished me out loud, in front of everyone, like I was a mouthy 13-year-old, all because I had the nerve to ask what my grandmother had left me in her estate. The room burst out laughing. My ears rang. My face went the kind of hot where you feel your own pulse behind your eyes. But I held his gaze, completely steady, and said 2 quiet words. Fine, okay. The next morning, he knocked on my bedroom door wearing the smirk of a man who had just won something. Glad you finally know your place, he said. Then the smirk disappeared. The room was empty. No bags, no clothes, no me. Before he could even reach for his phone, the doorbell rang. Standing on the front porch was a man in a gray suit, holding a worn leather briefcase and an expression that looked like a thunderstorm about to break. He wasn't a relative. He wasn't a neighbor. Mr. Holt, he said, his voice barely steady. Do you have any idea what you've done? I'll tell you what was in that briefcase. But first, if this story is speaking to something in you, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right now. I genuinely want to know. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the Tuesday morning in early September when the first domino fell. My grandmother, Eleanor Constance Holt, passed away at 6:09 in the morning at a hospital in Portland. She was 86 years old. My mother called me from the parking garage, her voice so thin it barely carried through the phone. She's gone, Cassidy. Grandma's gone. I remember the exact second I heard those words because I was already up, already at my drafting table in my 500-square-foot apartment in the inner east side of the city, working on a rain garden proposal for a client in the West Hills. I had tracing paper spread across the table and a cold cup of coffee I'd forgotten about. The moment she said it, I stopped drawing. I set the pen down. And I just sat there for a moment with the window open and the sound of early morning traffic trickling in from below. I drove to the hospital in the rain. No music, no podcasts, just the wet road and my breathing. When I arrived, my father was already there. Douglas Holt, 62 years old, a retired circuit court judge. 6 feet tall, wearing his hunting jacket even at a hospital, even at dawn. He was on his phone when I came through the corridor doors. I heard the words probate window and executor timeline before he noticed me and ended the call without so much as a goodbye to whoever was on the other end. My brother, Preston, 31, sharp suit, arm draped around my father's shoulder like a deputy at a press conference, was right beside him. The two of them looked like a campaign photo, solid, unified, a wall. I stood at the far end of the hallway and held a paper cup of vending machine coffee that I never drank. The last time I had visited my grandmother, she'd been in her garden on the south side of her house, sitting in a wheelchair in the late afternoon light, her hands surprisingly strong when they found mine. She'd looked at me sideways, glanced back toward the house to make sure we were alone, and said, "Cassidy, I've taken care of things. I need you to trust me." I nodded. I didn't know what she meant. Not yet. The funeral was 3 days later. Old stone church, white lilies, a mahogany casket polished to a mirror. My father gave the eulogy. He spoke for 12 minutes about the family name, about legacy, about continuity and tradition. He mentioned Preston 4 times by name. He mentioned my mother once. He did not mention me at all. At the reception afterward, a cousin of my uncle's leaned over and asked me what I was up to these days. Before I could answer, my father stepped in from behind. "Cassidy does garden design," he said. "She makes it pretty for people who can afford to pay someone else to get their hands dirty." A few people laughed politely. I felt the burn start behind my sternum and work its way up. I was turning toward the door when a man stepped into my path. Older gentleman. Silver hair, wire-framed glasses with thin gold frames. He reached for my hand, shook it gently, and said in a voice low enough that only I could hear, "Your grandmother was proud of you, more than you know. I'll be reaching out." Then he was gone, absorbed back into the crowd of black coats before I could think to ask his name. I didn't know it then, but that man was a lawyer named Thomas Hargrove, and he was the key to everything. That evening, the family gathered at my grandmother's house, the Holt house, a white Victorian on a quiet street in northeast Portland, black iron gate out front, a 100-year-old cedar tree in the side yard. My grandmother had bought the property with her own inheritance money long before she ever married my grandfather. She'd spent 50 years making it beautiful, the wide porch, the crown molding inside, the garden in the back where she grew pale pink peonies and sweet William and herbs that she used to cook with. From the outside, the house looked like a postcard of family happiness. That was always the point. The dining table inside was set with the family silver, 3 generations old. My father took his place at the head of the table without anyone asking him to. He raised his wine glass. "Mom left the management of her estate to me," he announced to the room. "I'll be handling everything. Distribution will go to the right people, those with the capacity to be responsible for it." His eyes moved across the table and landed on me. "Which means you don't need to worry about any of that, Cassidy. Numbers and legal things were never really your strength." Preston nodded from beside him like a man approving a motion in court. His wife, Celeste, adjusted the pearl bracelet on her wrist and said nothing. I set my fork down. "Dad, Grandma told me she took care of things." "Your grandmother was sentimental at the end," he said, cutting me off without missing a beat. "Whatever she said to you, whatever she implied, let it go. I'll handle it." My mother, Patricia, stared at her plate. She didn't look up. She never looked up when Douglas was talking. After dinner, I excused myself upstairs. I hadn't stayed in my old bedroom in 2 years, but it was still mine. The same cork board above the desk. The same drafting compass I'd used in high school still sitting in a cup by the window. The same smell of cedar and old wallpaper. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the nightstand drawer out of habit. There was an envelope inside that hadn't been there before. Cream-colored paper. Faint watermark. My name on the front in blue ink. A handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. Deliberate, slightly shaky, deeply familiar. Grandma's handwriting. My hands were trembling when I picked it up. I opened it slowly, sitting cross-legged on the bed I'd slept in from age 5 to age 18, the ceiling fan wobbling above me in that same slow, irregular rhythm it always had. The room smelled like cedar and old books. Inside were 2 things. The first was a letter, 2 pages, handwritten front and back. The pen pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper as though she wanted the words to be physical, unmovable, something that couldn't be erased. The second was a partial photocopy of a legal document. 6 pages from what appeared to be something much longer. The header read, Irrevocable Trust Agreement, ELEANORCONSTNC Holt Settlor. Halfway down the first page, highlighted in yellow, was one line. Beneficiary, Cassidy Renee Holt. I read the letter with tears coming down both sides of my face. Cassidy, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and your father is already doing exactly what I knew he would do. I'm sorry I couldn't stop it while I was alive. I tried in my way, but men like Douglas don't respond to words. They only respond to documents. The original trust is filed with my attorney, Thomas Hargrove. His office is on Northwest 21st Avenue. The copy I've left you is incomplete, not enough to prove anything on its own, but enough to show you I'm telling the truth. Don't share this with anyone. Not your father, not Preston, not even your mother. I love your mother. But she will tell Douglas. Wait for the right time. Thomas will know what to do. You have always been my builder, Cassidy. The one in this family who makes things instead of taking them. Don't let them flatten you. All my love, always, Grandma. I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest. The photocopy was incomplete. I had no lawyer. I barely had a name, just Thomas Hargrove and a street. My grandmother had been buried less than 48 hours. But for the first time in years, maybe the first time in my adult life, I felt something other than small. Someone had seen me, the real me, and she'd put it in writing. I drove back to Portland the next morning without saying goodbye to anyone. No one noticed, or if they did, no one reached out. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Plants on every windowsill, drafting table buried under tracing paper, a cold mug of tea sitting by the sink that I'd forgotten about 2 days earlier. I loved this place even though it was tiny. It was mine. No one here got to tell me what I wasn't. I sat at my laptop and searched for Thomas Hargrove, attorney, Portland. The results came up immediately. A solo practice on Northwest 21st Avenue. Estate planning and trust law. The headshot showed a silver-haired man with thin gold-framed glasses. The man from the funeral. My cursor hovered over the phone number. I didn't call. Not yet. Because there was a part of me, the part my father had been conditioning since before I could drive, that whispered. What if Grandma really was confused at the end? What if you pick up that phone and find out the one person who ever truly believed in you was just a sick woman who didn't fully understand what she was signing? I wasn't ready to risk that. Not yet. Instead, I worked. A landscape architecture firm downtown needed me to finalize a concept for a rooftop garden on a new mixed-use development in the Pearl District. I had a deadline. I needed the income. I was still carrying $36,000 in student debt from the year I spent in law school before leaving to pursue design, the year my father told me I was betraying the family. I was checking project specifications when I saw something buried in my inbox. An email from Preston. Not to me exactly, forwarded to me by accident. The subject line, RE, Trust Amendment Draft Filing. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. I read the first 3 lines. Then my phone buzzed with a work deadline reminder and I had to close the laptop and get to the office. But I'd seen enough. Enough to know that whatever they were planning had already started. 3 weeks went by. I put my head down and worked 16-hour days on the rooftop garden project, the kind of focused labor that keeps you from having to think about things you're not ready to face. But that email sat in my inbox like a splinter under skin. I hadn't gone back to open it. I wasn't sure I was ready. Then my mother called. "Cassidy, your father wants the whole family together for Thanksgiving." Her voice had that particular flatness it got when she was passing along Douglas Holt's instructions while pretending they were family decisions. "He says he wants to reconnect, to smooth things over." I almost laughed. My father had never smoothed anything over in his life. He broke things and then explained why the fracture was your fault for being made of the wrong material. "I'll think about it, Mom. Please, honey, he's making an effort." "I'll let you know," I said and hung up. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, a second-hand piece I'd sanded and restained myself, and finally opened Preston's forwarded email. It was a chain. 6 messages back and forth between him and my father over 2 weeks. The subject line told me everything, but the content told me more. Preston had drafted a legal petition to the court requesting a change of beneficiary on my grandmother's trust. The grounds he cited were financial instability of the currently named beneficiary, me. He'd written, in actual legal language submitted to an actual court, that I had demonstrated a pattern of erratic career choices, held no significant assets, and carried student debt inconsistent with fiduciary responsibility. My brother had written that about me in a court filing, but the line that made my vision go blurry wasn't the legalese. It was the casual note Preston had typed at the bottom of the chain to our father. "She's not going to fight this. She's never fought anything. That's the whole point, Dad." I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Then I screenshot every message in the chain, backed them up to my cloud storage, and copied them onto a thumb drive I kept in my desk drawer. After that, I called my mother back. "Tell Dad I'll be there for Thanksgiving." I was going back, not to patch things up, to finish something. The morning after I made that call, I dialed the number for Thomas Hargrove's office. An older woman answered, professional, unhurried. I gave my name. There was a brief pause. "Miss Holt," she said, "Mr. Hargrove has been expecting to hear from you. Are you available to come in today?" 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him in a modest office lined floor to ceiling with legal volumes that were clearly used rather than decorative, an oriental rug that had seen better decades. A cold cup of coffee on his desk. He looked exactly like the man from the funeral, the same measured stillness, the same gold-framed glasses, the same sense that every word he was about to say had been chosen in advance. "Your grandmother hired me 23 years ago," he said. "I wrote her original will and her living trust. And 8 years ago, after a conversation that left me genuinely troubled, she asked me to create an irrevocable trust with you as the sole and exclusive beneficiary." He opened a leather portfolio and placed a document across the desk in front of me. Original paper, thick and cream-colored. A notary's embossed seal from the state of Oregon. Signatures at the bottom. Trust corpus, $630,000, held and managed by First Pacific Trust Bank. Irrevocable means exactly that, he said. Your father, as named trustee, has administrative authority only. He cannot change the beneficiary. Any attempt to do so requires either your written consent or a court ruling that your grandmother lacked mental competency at the time of signing. He paused. Your grandmother anticipated that argument. She arranged for her physician, Dr. Susan Cho, to perform a full cognitive evaluation the same week she executed this trust. The results are in the file. She scored well above average for her age group. She was perfectly sharp. I exhaled, the first full breath I'd taken in what felt like weeks. There's more, Hargrove said. Your father filed a petition to the court requesting a beneficiary change 3 weeks ago. He listed Preston as the intended substitute beneficiary. In his filing, he claimed he had been unable to locate you to obtain your consent. The old lawyer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You and I both know that's not true. I showed him the email chain. He read it without expression, then looked up over his glasses. This is direct evidence of a deliberate breach of fiduciary duty. If you choose to contest this, you have more than enough to win. I want to contest it, I said. He nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, there's one more thing, Cassidy. Your grandmother also included the Cannon Beach property in the trust. A small cedar cottage on the coast. She purchased it independently decades ago. It's listed in the full trust document. I don't believe your father is aware of it because he never read past the first few pages. I stared at him. The Cannon Beach cottage. The place where Grandma and I used to spend the last week of every summer when I was a kid. The porch where we'd sit in the evenings and watch Haystack Rock go from gold to copper to shadow while the tide rolled out. She'd told me once it was the truest place she'd ever known. She'd left it to me. Thomas Hargrove looked at me steadily over his glasses. Your grandmother spent 8 years making sure you'd be protected after she was gone. The question now is when you want to use what she built. Thanksgiving, I said. He's invited the entire family, 30 people in that house. Hargrove studied me for a moment. Then he gave a single, slow nod. I'll be ready. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I packed light, 1 change of clothes. My wool coat, camel-colored, bought secondhand from a shop on Alberta Street, one of the nicest things I owned. A toothbrush, and a manila envelope thick with notarized copies. The originals stayed with Hargrove. We'd agreed on that. He would hold the master set in his office safe. I'd carry certified copies, notarized, stamped, admissible as secondary evidence if things escalated. The originals were for the courtroom. The copies were for the family. I drove south through the rain, through the amber hills of autumn Oregon, the highway flanked by trees that had already gone full rust. The sky was that particular northwest gray that never commits to anything. The Holt house came through the tree line the way it always had. White Victorian, black gate, the old cedar standing watch. From the street, it looked like what every family wants people to believe it is. My mother met me at the door. She held on too long when she hugged me, the way she does when she wants to say something she won't let herself say. Your father's in his study, she murmured. He's in a mood. I took my bag upstairs, my old bedroom, cork board, twin bed with the floral quilt she'd had on it since I was a kid. The nightstand drawer now empty, I'd taken the envelope last time. From downstairs, I could hear Preston's laugh and the sound of wine being poured and Celeste saying something bright and hollow. I slid the manila envelope under the mattress. Then I stood at the window and looked out at my grandmother's garden. The peony beds were brown and tangled. Nobody had touched them since she got too weak to kneel. The sight of it made my throat go tight. I pressed my palm flat against the cold glass. I'm here, Grandma, I said. I'm here. Downstairs, the Cabernet Franc was breathing on the counter, and the fire was going, and my father didn't stand up when I walked in. He looked at me from the armchair and said, without warmth, "You actually came." Preston was on the couch beside Celeste, a glass of wine dangling from his fingers. He took in my coat, slightly pilled at the elbows, a thread loose at the second button, and said, "Still rocking the vintage look, Cass?" I smiled. I sat down. I said nothing. Tomorrow, 31 relatives would fill this house. My father had organized the largest Thanksgiving in Holt family history. I didn't know why until later, but I should have understood immediately. Richard Brennan, my father, had never done anything large without an audience. Thanksgiving morning filled the house like a theater filling before a curtain goes up. Cars lined both sides of the street by 10. Aunt Beverly and Uncle Harris from Bend. The Castellano cousins from Salem. Great-Aunt Ruth, who'd flown in from Scottsdale and who had opinions about everything and kept them to herself for no one. By noon, 33 people occupied the Holt house, and the noise was a physical thing, layers of laughter, children's footsteps overhead, the oven timer beeping at irregular intervals. I helped in the kitchen because nobody asked me to do anything else. My mother and Celeste sat at the breakfast counter drinking herbal tea while I peeled potatoes and chopped celery for the stuffing. The household dynamic hadn't shifted since I was 12. In the Holt family, I was the one who showed up early and cleaned up last and was thanked by no one. At 4, we sat down to eat. The long table in the dining room held 16. A second table had been set up in the living room for the overflow, where I was placed between a 9-year-old second cousin named Marcus and an empty chair. My father stood at the head of the main table beneath the crystal chandelier, polished silver, white linen, the family's good glassware catching the candlelight. He raised his wine glass. "This year has tested us," he said, the room going quiet for his courtroom voice. "We lost Mom, that's a weight we'll all carry, but the Holt family endures, and I want to take a moment to recognize my son, Preston, who just settled the most significant case of his career." He turned to Preston with something close to reverence. "To you, son, this family's future is in good hands." Applause. Preston accepted it the way he accepted most things, with practiced modesty, a small nod, his hand finding Celeste's shoulder like a man who's rehearsed the gesture. From the second table, Aunt Beverly called out, "What about Cassidy? Any exciting news from you, sweetheart?" I opened my mouth. My father spoke first. "Cassidy is still finding her footing." He didn't look at me. "She's creative, we'll grant her that. Some people need more time to figure out where they belong." He smiled at the room. "The rest of us are just happy to know she's still out there digging in the dirt." Laughter moved across both tables in a wave, 30 people laughing. I sat very still, spine straight, hands in my lap, face neutral, the way I'd been sitting in this chair since I was 8 years old. The 9-year-old beside me looked up with solemn eyes. "Are you okay?" he whispered. "I'm fine," I said, and handed him the bread basket. After the pie was served and the port was flowing and the room had settled into that warm golden haze that comes at the end of a holiday meal, my father stood again. The room quieted by instinct. "One more thing before the evening winds down." His voice had the weight of a man about to read a verdict. "Tomorrow morning, I'll be making a formal announcement regarding my mother's estate. I'd ask that everyone plan to be present." He smiled. "It's what she would have wanted." He looked directly at me as he said it. I excused myself to do the dishes. The kitchen was quiet except for the running water. I stood at the sink scrubbing a roasting pan, suds to my elbows, still in the same sweater I'd driven down in. 33 people in the next room, not one of whom had offered to help clear a single plate. I heard footsteps. Preston leaned in the doorway with his wine glass and his practiced casualness. "Honestly, Cass," he said, "you should be grateful Dad even set a place for you, beyond the kids' table." He smiled like it was a joke. I kept scrubbing. I didn't turn around, but something in me, some wire stretched tight for 29 years, finally hummed. "Preston," I said, my voice quiet and even, "do you know what Grandma actually left me?" The silence behind me changed texture. I heard his wine glass clink against the counter. When I glanced over my shoulder, his face had gone perfectly still. He left the kitchen without a word. 10 minutes later, my father's voice came from the living room like a crack of thunder. "Cassidy, get in here. Now." I dried my hands, folded the dish towel over the oven handle, and walked in. 33 faces turned to look at me. The chandelier scattered small rainbows across the ceiling. My father stood in the center of the room, one hand gripping his wine glass, the other pointing at me like I was a defendant he'd already decided to convict. "What did you say to your brother?" His courtroom voice. The one engineered to make the room feel smaller and people inside it feel smaller still. "You threatened him. You think you can manipulate this family with some story about your grandmother's estate." I opened my mouth. He didn't let me. "You're grounded," he said. "Go to your room and don't come back down until you're ready to apologize to your brother." The room exploded. Not in protest, in laughter. 33 adults, most of them over 40, laughing because Douglas Holt had just grounded his 29-year-old daughter like she'd stayed out past curfew. Aunt Beverly covered her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking. Uncle Harris snorted. Even Celeste let out a little gasp that was really a giggle dressed up as shock. My face burned. The heat climbed from my chest to my collar to the back of my skull. I looked for my mother. She was in the corner staring at her own hands. Silent. She didn't say stop. She didn't say that's enough. Nobody did. I held my father's gaze for 3 full seconds, then I said very calmly, "All right." I turned around. I walked upstairs. I closed the bedroom door behind me. Then I took out my phone and called Thomas Hargrove. It rang twice. "Mr. Hargrove," I said, "I need you to come to the house tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Bring the originals." A pause. "I'll be there," he said. I hung up, set my alarm for 4 in the morning, and sat on the edge of the twin bed in the dark, listening to the laughter still rising through the floorboards below me. I let myself hear it for a moment. I let it be exactly what it was. Laugh, I thought. All of you. This is the last time it goes this way. I left at 4:17 in the morning. No drama. No slamming doors. I packed in the dark, moved in socks down the creaking staircase, and let the front door fall closed behind me with barely a sound. The only thing I left behind was a photograph of my grandmother that I'd placed face down on the nightstand. I drove to an all-night diner 3 miles away and ordered coffee I mostly didn't drink and watched the light outside slowly change from black to gray to pale November blue. At 7:51, my phone buzzed. "Preston, where are you?" "Dad's looking for you." I didn't respond. Inside the Holt house, according to what my cousin Danny told me later, the morning unfolded like this. My father came downstairs at 7:30, freshly dressed, looking like a man about to chair a board meeting. He poured his coffee, surveyed the room, and said with practiced authority, "Someone go tell Cassidy it's time to come down and make things right." No one moved. Not out of solidarity with me, just because nobody wanted to be the one sent on that errand. Douglas climbed the stairs himself. 2 knocks, crisp, expectant. "Cassidy, it's morning, we're waiting." Silence. He opened the door. The bed was made. The closet was open and empty. The drawers were cleared. The room had nothing of me left in it, nothing except the photograph of my grandmother, placed face down on the nightstand like a punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. Danny told me later that my father stood in that doorway for a full 8 seconds before his face shifted. He came back downstairs slowly. "Cassidy's gone," he announced to the 24 relatives still at breakfast. His voice was flat, controlled. "Left in the middle of the night." He shook his head. "Like a coward." Preston looked up from his phone and smiled. "Well," he said, "that makes things simpler." My father set down his coffee cup. "It certainly does. I was planning to make the estate announcement at 10, but since the only person who might have objections has apparently decided to," the doorbell rang. My mother opened the front door. On the porch, in a gray suit with a worn brown briefcase and an expression that looked like weather moving in off the coast, stood Thomas Hargrove. "My name is Thomas Hargrove," he said. "I'm the attorney of record for Alina Constance Holt. I need to address the entire family. Right now." The dining room went quiet room by room, the way silence spreads at a funeral, first the people nearest the door, then a ripple outward, until even the children noticed that the adults had stopped making noise. Thomas Hargrove walked into the room the way a man walks into a courtroom. No hurry, no theater. just the complete, unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where he stands and why. He set his briefcase on the dining table, right on top of the leftover Thanksgiving linen, unclasped it without sitting down, and removed a bound document without looking around for permission. His hands had a visible tremor, not nerves, anger. My father rose from his chair. He was taller than Hargrove by several inches and broader across the shoulders, and he used all of it. Thomas. The name came out like a warning. You were not invited to this house. Hargrove looked at him calmly. This is the house Alina Holt built with her family's money, Mr. Holt. I'm here because I have a legal obligation, a fiduciary duty, to the beneficiary of her trust. Cassidy has no rights to. Cassidy is the sole named beneficiary of an irrevocable trust executed 8 years ago. You know this. You have known this since the morning your mother signed it. The room went still enough that you could have heard someone breathing 3 doors away. 30 pairs of eyes moved between the two men. My father's jaw clenched. My mother was in cognitive decline. Whatever she signed was signed in the presence of 2 independent witnesses and accompanied by a physician's certification of full mental competency. I have the documentation. Hargrove opened the folder and removed a sheaf of papers. Would you like me to read it aloud to everyone present, Mr. Holt? Or would you prefer to discuss this privately? The question hung in the room like smoke. Aunt Beverly leaned forward in her chair. Uncle Harris set down his coffee. Even the children had gone completely silent. My father looked at the documents in Hargrove's hands the way you look at something pointed at your chest. Then he pulled his shoulders back and said very quietly, "Get out of my house." Hargrove didn't move. "Mr. Holt," he said, his voice dropping half a register, "what have you done?" What happened next was the moment the mask cracked, not slowly, not gracefully, but suddenly and completely right down the center. My father stepped forward. "I said get out. You are trespassing on private property. I will call the police." "You're welcome to," Hargrove said, standing exactly where he stood. "And when they arrive, I will show them the petition you filed with the Multnomah County Circuit Court 6 weeks ago, the one where you claim to be unable to locate the trust beneficiary." He paused. "The beneficiary whose phone number you have, whose address you have, who was sleeping in this house last night." The color left my father's face in a single wave. Around the room, I could see it spreading, Margaret pressing her hand over her mouth, Uncle Harris's brow folding, cousins exchanging glances. That was when Preston stood up. My brother, the golden one, the attorney, the man who always knew which angle to work, stepped forward with both hands raised, his voice smooth and managed. "Mr. Hargrove, I appreciate you coming, but any documents you're referencing can be contested through the proper legal channels, and I'd suggest that. You drafted the petition, didn't you?" Hargrove turned to him. The question landed like a scalpel. "You prepared a fraudulent legal filing to redirect the trust assets on behalf of your father, who is the trustee, and you did it while concealing a direct conflict of interest." Preston's composure didn't shatter. It simply evaporated. One moment he was a confident attorney with his hands up and his voice steady. The next, his mouth had gone slack and his eyes had moved involuntarily, unmistakably, to our father. "Dad," he said under his breath, "we need to talk alone." Douglas didn't even look at him. "I have nothing to hide." Aunt Beverly stood up from her chair. She had been watching my father run gatherings like this one for 30 years, and something in her face had finally had enough. "Douglas," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who is done pretending. "Let the man speak." A murmur moved through the room, not loud, not defiant, but present, like the first sounds of ice beginning to shift. My father looked around at the assembled faces and seemed to register, perhaps for the first time, that the audience he had assembled for his own performance was no longer on his side. "This is absurd," he said, but the courtroom resonance was gone from his voice. It sounded thin now, hollow, like tissue paper held up to the light. Hargrove looked at him steadily for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked to the door. "I'll leave," he said, "but I'll return at 2 o'clock this afternoon for the formal estate reading that you yourself scheduled, Mr. Holt. It's on your own calendar, and I won't be coming alone." The front door closed behind him. My father turned back to the room, smoothed his shirt, adjusted his watch. "I apologize you had to witness that," he said. "Cassidy hired a lawyer to stir the pot and then ran from the conversation like she always does. This afternoon, I'll present the actual estate plan my mother intended. Everything will be clear." He sat back down. Garrett closed his laptop. His face was arranged carefully into something neutral, but his hands were moving fast on the keyboard, deleting things I'd realize later. The email chain. The room exhaled. Conversations resumed cautiously. People refilled their coffee. The crisis had been paused. Richard Brennan was still standing at the head of the table, or so he believed. I was parked outside a coffee shop on Division Street watching rain trace lines down the windshield. At 8:22 that morning, I had sent a formal email to the Trust Management Division at First Pacific Trust Bank requesting written confirmation of my status as sole beneficiary. At 9:47, the reply came from a trust officer named Miriam Wells. Dear Miss Holt, this is to confirm that you are the sole named beneficiary of the Aliner C. Holt Irrevocable Trust. The trust corpus of $630,000 remains intact and has not been dispersed. A petition to amend the beneficiary designation was submitted by the trustee, Douglas A. Holt, on October 19th, but has not been approved by the court. No disbursements can be made without your written authorization. I read it 3 times. I saved it, backed it up, and printed a copy at a FedEx 2 blocks away. At 11:20, Hargrove called. He threw me out, he said with what might have been dry amusement. Threatened to have me arrested. I know, Danny texted me. 2 o'clock, Cassidy, I'll be on the block behind the house. You go in first, I follow when you signal. Okay, a pause. Are you sure about this? Once it starts, it can't be undone. I looked out the window. A woman was walking by in the rain with a small child beside her, both of them stepping deliberately into every puddle they passed, both of them laughing about it. I've been undoing myself my whole life, I said. Every time I walked into that house and swallowed something I should have said out loud. I'm done with that. Then I'll see you at 2. I hung up, opened my sun visor mirror. The face looking back at me was pale and tired and completely cert. I started the car. At 12:30, I sat across from Hargrove in his office one last time and we went through the full file, 4 stacks on his desk. Stack 1, the original irrevocable trust. Aliner's signature in blue ink, firm and deliberate. Notary's red seal. Dr. Cho's physician letter confirming cognitive competency at the time of signing, date stamped and countersigned. Stack 2, the email chain between my father and Preston, printed with full metadata, sender addresses, routing information, timestamps. The line "she's not going to fight this" highlighted in yellow on the final page. Stack 3, the confirmation letter from Miriam Wells at First Pacific Trust Bank. Intact balance, no disbursements. Petition filed but unapproved. Stack 4, something I hadn't seen before. Hargrove slid it across the desk. A property deed, Multnomah County. 4,892 square feet on a corner lot in northeast Portland. The Holt House, the Victorian. I looked up. The deed has been in Aliner's name since 1979, Hargrove said. She purchased it with her own inheritance money before she married your grandfather. Douglas has lived there for decades, but he has never held the deed. He simply never questioned it because he never questioned anything that was handed to him. Hargrove tapped the paper. Under the terms of the trust, ownership transfers to the named beneficiary upon Aliner's death. He doesn't know, I said. He read the first 4 pages of the trust document, Hargrove confirmed. The pages that named him trustee, then he stopped reading. Of course he had. My father had never needed to read the fine print. He was the final word. The only authority that mattered, until now. I gathered the 4 stacks into the manila envelope. We shook hands. I go in first, I said. You come in when I signal. How will I know? You'll know, I said. At 1:48 in the afternoon, I turned onto the street where I'd grown up. The rain had stopped. A pale November sun had pushed through the clouds, throwing long light across the wet pavement, turning the whole street into something like a mirror. The cedar tree in the side yard of the Holt house had lost all its leaves. Its branches were a dark lattice against the washed-out sky. I drove slowly. This was the street where my grandmother had taught me to ride a bike, steadying the seat with one hand and letting go before I knew she had. The sidewalk where she walked me to school the year my parents were too consumed with their own lives to remember what time first grade started. The front yard where she'd knelt beside me in the dirt when I was 6 years old and shown me how to transplant a seedling without disturbing its roots. The secret, she'd said, pressing my small hand into the earth, is to take the whole root ball. You don't leave any of it behind. My phone buzzed. My mother, Cassidy, please, your father is furious. Come in and apologize. We can still fix this, please. I pulled to the curb and answered. Mom, I'm coming in, but not to apologize. A silence. Then very small, what are you going to do? The right thing, I said. I'll see you inside. I parked behind the house, next to Hargrove's silver sedan. He was already there, briefcase in his lap, reading glasses on. He looked up through the windshield and gave me a single nod. I got out. Camel coat, canvas bag with the manila envelope inside, hands steady. The gate was unlocked. The front door was open. From inside, I could hear the sound of 30 people gathered and waiting for Douglas Holt to tell them how things were. I walked up the porch steps my grandmother had put in and pushed the door open. I entered through the side hallway and stood just outside the arched doorway to the living room, out of sight. Through the arch, I could see what my father had staged. The room had been rearranged, chairs pulled from every corner of the house, all facing the fireplace, all facing him. 30 people seated and attentive, like a congregation assembled for a reading. My father stood before the fire in his pressed Oxford shirt, the tortoiseshell reading glasses he used to wear on the bench perched on his nose. In one hand, a single sheet of paper. He held it the way judges hold verdicts, high enough to be seen, low enough to keep the audience from reading along. Thank you all for being here, he said. My mother's passing left certain matters unresolved, and I want to address them in a way that reflects her actual wishes. He glanced up at the room, a practiced, measured pause. The educational trust of $630,000 will be transferred to Preston's stewardship for the benefit of the next generation. Another pause. For Cassidy, a small, merciful smile. Mom wanted her to have something, a gesture of goodwill, $5,000. A few sympathetic nods. Celeste placed her hand on Preston's arm. Preston lowered his eyes in a performance of humility so smooth it could have won something. Any questions? My father asked. From the hallway, I took one full breath. Then I stepped through the arch into the room. Behind me, the front door opened quietly. Thomas Hargrove walked in. 30 heads turned. 30 faces, some surprised, some relieved to see me, a few openly confused. My cousin Danny, seated near the back wall, gave me a small, firm nod. Aunt Beverly straightened in her chair. My father's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, irritation. Then the hardening, the courtroom mask snapping back into place. Well, he said, look who came back. A few obligatory chuckles from the room. I assumed you'd made your decision, Cassidy. Are you here to apologize to your brother? No, I said. My voice was steady in a way that surprised me because my heart was going hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I'm here for the real will reading, the one that's actually legally binding. I walked past him, past his pointed finger, past his good watch and his pressed collar and the 30 years of Sunday dinners he'd presided over from that chair. I told you that from the start. You said you'd handle it. I told you this was a risk. You said she'd never find out, my father said. The room went very quiet. 30 people heard Douglas Holt confirm every single word Thomas Hargrove had presented. The wine glass in my father's hand, the same one he'd been holding the night before when he grounded me in front of everyone, slipped from his fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor. The dark red spread slowly across the pale wood toward the edge of the Persian rug, and no one moved to do anything about it. Then something shifted. His posture changed. The aggression fell away, and in its place came something I recognized, the thing my father did when every other strategy had failed. His voice softened. His shoulders dropped. He turned to me with his eyes glistening and said, with the practiced warmth of a man who has used warmth as a tool for decades, Cassidy, sweetheart. The word fell into the room like a counterfeit coin on marble. I was trying to protect the family. You're young. You don't have experience managing this kind of money. I was doing this out of love for you. You have to understand that. I looked at him, the man who had called my career a punchline, who had put me at the children's table, who had publicly grounded me at 29 in front of every living relative I had, who had signed a sworn statement to a court claiming he couldn't find me while I was sleeping 20 feet above him, I let 3 seconds pass. Then I said, "You didn't do this because you love me, Dad. You did it because you've never believed a daughter deserved the same as a son. That's not love. That's just control dressed up in different clothes." My mother stood up. I hadn't noticed until that moment that she was crying, but she was, quietly, her face wet, her hands trembling at her sides. She looked at my father, the man she had been sitting beside and staying silent for 35 years, and said in a voice that shook but did not stop, "You owe her an apology, Douglas. You have owed her one her entire life." The room held its breath. My father looked at her as though she had spoken in a language he'd never learned. Then he looked at me, then at the room. Then he turned without a word and walked into his study and closed the door. In the minutes that followed, the room rearranged itself. Not the furniture, the people. The invisible architecture of the Holt family, the lines of allegiance that had structured every gathering for as long as I could remember, shifted quietly and permanently, the way tectonic plates shift without announcement and without going back. Aunt Beverly reached me first. She pulled me into a hug and said close to my ear, "Your grandmother would be so proud of you right now, Cassidy. I mean that with everything I have." Danny squeezed my shoulder. "You've always been the strongest one in this family," he said. "You just never had to prove it before today." Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years came forward, a handshake, a quiet "I'm sorry," a nod that meant more than most conversations I'd had in that house. Not everyone. Some stayed in their chairs, staring at the table. A few quietly gathered their things and left, not in protest, just in the way people leave a room where something has broken that they don't know how to hold. Preston stood up from the sofa. He didn't look at me. He walked to the front door with Celeste at his side. In the hallway, Celeste paused, reached up, and unclasped her pearl bracelet, slipped it off her wrist and folded it into her coat pocket, as though she wanted to make herself smaller, less visible, less associated with whatever had just happened. Hargrove organized the documents methodically back into his briefcase. "I'll file for removal of the trustee Monday morning," he said. 30-day process, roughly. The trust is frozen in the meantime, no disbursements, no alterations. He clicked the clasp. 47 minutes, he added quietly, almost to himself. I looked at the Waterford crystal clock on the mantelpiece. 2:52 p.m., 30 years of silence answered in 47 minutes. That Monday, Hargrove filed 3 documents with Multnomah County Circuit Court. The first, a petition to remove Douglas A. Holt as trustee, citing breach of fiduciary duty. Specifically, failure to notify the beneficiary, misrepresentation to the court regarding her whereabouts, an unauthorized attempt to alter an irrevocable instrument. The second, a formal motion appointing Hargrove as interim trustee pending a permanent appointment by the beneficiary. The third, a complaint filed with the Oregon State Bar against Preston R. Holt for violation of professional conduct rules. Specifically, preparing a fraudulent court filing that would benefit an immediate family member while concealing a direct conflict of interest. Within 2 weeks, the court granted the trustee removal on an interim basis. My father's attorney, a man from a mid-size Lake Oswego firm he'd finally managed to reach the following week, advised him bluntly that he had no legal ground to stand on. "Irrevocable means irrevocable," I was told the lawyer had said. "And the email evidence is damaging enough that fighting this will cost you more than it could possibly be worth." The $630,000 trust was transferred to an account in my name. Miriam Wells called me personally to confirm. The deed to the house on the corner of Northeast Portland, the house my grandmother had built with her own inheritance money, the house where I'd grown up being made to feel like a guest, was updated. My name replaced hers. Preston received his notice of investigation from the Oregon State Bar. The process took months. The outcome was a 6-month suspension. His largest client, a commercial real estate firm, dropped him within days of the complaint becoming known in the right circles. He eventually transitioned to corporate consulting work that required no bar membership and no courtroom appearances. My father called me 3 days after the court filing. I answered because I thought even then, even after all of it, that maybe he'd finally say the words I'd been waiting for. He didn't. "You've destroyed this family," he said. "No, Dad," I said. "You did, I just showed up with the evidence." He hung up. I haven't heard from him since. 2 weeks after the court order, Thomas Hargrove handed me a key on a plain brass ring across his desk and said simply, "It's yours now." I don't know why those 2 words broke me open more than anything else that day. Maybe because no one in my family had ever said something was mine without adding a condition. I drove to the house alone, parked on the street. The cedar tree in the side yard was bare now, its branches dark against the December sky. The black iron gate creaked when I pushed it open, the same creak I'd heard 10,000 times. I turned the key. The door swung open onto the foyer. The smell hit me first. Wood polish, old paper, the faint sweetness of the lavender sachets my grandmother kept in every closet. Without my father's voice filling every room and every conversation, the house felt different. It felt like it was breathing differently, like it was resting for the first time in years. I walked through every room slowly. The living room, where 30 people had sat and watched everything change. The dining table still bearing ghost rings from port glasses. The kitchen where I'd scrubbed a roasting pan alone while my family laughed in the next room. Upstairs, my old bedroom, the cork board, the twin bed. My grandmother's room, her reading chair by the window, her stack of novels still waiting on the side table, her reading glasses folded beside them like she just stepped away for a moment. And then the garden. I stood at the back door and looked out at what had been the pride of Alina Holt's life. The peony beds, brown now, tangled, edged with overgrown boxwood. The stone path she'd laid herself barely visible under a deep bed of dead leaves. The bird bath sitting empty and gray. I knelt down, pressed both palms flat against the cold earth, closed my eyes. "I'll fix it, Grandma," I said. "I'll bring it all back." And I knew with the kind of certainty that only comes from grief and love and soil under your fingernails at the same time that I would. A week later, on a Saturday morning cold enough to see my breath, I drove 90 minutes west to the coast. Cannon Beach. I hadn't been in 6 years. The last time was the summer before my grandmother's health began its long decline. The two of us on the porch of the cedar cottage, chamomile tea going cold in our cups, watching Haystack Rock turn from amber to copper to shadow as the tide pulled back. She'd said, "This is the truest place I know, Cassidy. When I'm gone, I want someone who loves it to have it." I thought she was being sentimental. She was being precise. The cottage was smaller than I remembered, or I was larger. Weathered cedar shingles, a porch wrapping around 2 sides. Salt air so thick you could taste it on your lips before you even stepped out of the car. The key Hargrove had given me turned smoothly, and the door opened onto a space that still smelled like her. Lavender and old paperbacks, and the particular sweet sharpness of cedar walls in winter. On the kitchen table, placed deliberately in the center like it had been waiting, was a wooden box with a simple latch. I lifted the lid. Inside, a stack of photographs. My grandmother and me at various ages, 5 through 22, in this very cottage. Building driftwood structures on the beach. Standing in matching rubber boots on a stormy afternoon, both of us grinning at something long forgotten. Planting beach grass in the dunes with our hands, side by side. Under the photographs, a letter. Short this time, just a few lines. "Cassidy, if you're reading this, you were brave enough. I always knew you would be. This house is yours. It always was. I was just keeping it warm until you came. Start over here if you need to. Come when the world gets too loud. Come for no reason at all. Either way, it will be waiting. I am so proud of you. I always have been. All my love, Grandma." I sat on the porch, her porch, my porch, and I cried. Not the way I'd been crying in that twin bed with the door closed, stifled and ashamed and careful not to make a sound. This was different. This was the kind of crying that opens something instead of shutting it down. The kind that leaves you lighter, not emptier. The ocean was wide and gray and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in that living room, and there was an unexpected comfort in that. The tide didn't know who Douglas Holt was. The waves had no memory of irrevocable trusts or Thanksgiving dinners or folding tables at the back of the room. Haystack Rock had been standing there for 15 million years and would keep standing long after every last one of us was gone. I wiped my face, took a long breath of salt air. For the first time in months, I felt something I had almost forgotten the shape of. Peace. That Sunday night, back in Portland, I sat at the oak dining table in the Holt house, my house, and wrote an email to my family. I wrote it once, read it twice, and sent it without a third revision, because I knew if I kept editing, I'd start softening things that needed to stay sharp. To Douglas Holt, Patricia Holt, Preston Holt, I don't want to cut anyone out. That was never the point of any of this. But I won't go back to a relationship where I am belittled, dismissed, or treated as less than. If you want to be in my life, It will be on terms of genuine mutual respect. Not hierarchy, not performance, not the version of this family where I sit at the folding table and smile. The door is open, but it swings both ways now. Cassidy, my mother, called 20 minutes later. She was crying the real kind, not the anxious kind. "I'm so sorry, Cassidy," she said. "I should have stood up for you so many years ago. I was afraid of him. I know that's not an excuse." "It's just the truth." "I know, Mom," I said. "I don't blame you, but I need you to start choosing what's right over what's comfortable. Can you try?" A long pause. "I'm going to try," she said. Preston responded by text the next morning. 2 words, "I understand." I set the phone down and didn't reply. Understanding was a beginning. But it wasn't the same thing as accountability. That was his work to do. I'd leave the door open the way I said I would. I just wasn't going to stand in the doorway holding it. My father didn't respond. Not that day, not the following week, not the week after that. The silence was its own answer. Familiar, really. Douglas Holt had been silent on the things that actually mattered for my entire life. At least now I'd stopped waiting. 6 months later, it was spring. The peonies came back. I'd spent the entire winter on my hands and knees in my grandmother's garden, clearing, pruning, turning the soil that had gone hard and sour from 2 years of neglect. The roots went deeper than I'd expected. They had survived the abandonment. They just needed someone to cut away what was dead and let the light reach them. I knew the feeling. I paid off my student debt in full. $36,412, the most satisfying check I have ever written in my life. With a portion of the trust, I leased a small studio in the Alberta Arts District, Holt Landscape Design. My name on the door. My grandmother's name, really. The Holt name meant something completely different to me now than it had at the start of all this. The old study downstairs, my father's throne room, the leather chair and the mahogany bookshelves and the framed photographs of Douglas shaking hands with Oregon judges became my design studio. I replaced the legal volumes with plant identification guides. I stacked the shelves with seed catalogs and soil samples and the kind of reference books that smell like possibility. It felt right. It felt like rewriting something. Danny came by on weekends to help in the garden. Aunt Beverly called every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, just checking in, and then we'd talk for an hour about nothing and everything. My mother came to visit for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in April, the first time she'd ever walked through the front door without Douglas beside her. We didn't say much. We planted tulip bulbs along the front walk, side by side in the cold dirt, and that was enough. My father rented an apartment across the city. I heard through Beverly that he'd been telling people I'd stolen the house, that my grandmother had been manipulated, that the whole thing was Thomas Hargrove's doing. The story changed shape depending on who was listening, but it always had the same ending, Douglas Holt as the victim of a conspiracy. Some things, I suppose, are truly irrevocable. Preston's state bar suspension ran at 6 months. He'd moved to consulting work, something in supply chain logistics. He and Celeste had quietly separated, though I didn't know the details and didn't ask. He hadn't reached out again after that 2-word text. I left the door open the way I said I would. I just wasn't standing in the doorway waiting anymore. I'm telling you this story from the porch of the Cannon Beach cottage. It's a Saturday morning. The tide is out. Haystack Rock is doing what it always does standing there, ancient and solid, unbothered by anything as temporary as a family argument or a court filing or 30 years of Thanksgiving dinners where I sat in the wrong chair. I come here on weekends when I need to remember what quiet sounds like. The cottage is exactly as my grandmother left it, except I've added a small herb garden by the front steps. Rosemary, sage, thyme, lavender, the kind of plants that get tougher the more wind they take. I'm not telling this story because I think it will teach you something. I don't believe in that kind of story. Every family is its own country with its own language and its own private wars. The people inside it are the only ones who know the actual map. I can't tell you what to do with your father or your mother or your inheritance or your silence. I can only tell you what I did and what I learned from doing it. Here's what I know now. Silence is not consent. I spent 29 years being quiet at the dinner table, and the people around me took that quiet and called it agreement. It wasn't. It was a woman who hadn't found her evidence yet, and who was waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for exactly the right moment. Patience is not surrender. My father and brother built their entire strategy on the certainty that I wouldn't fight back. They were almost right. What they failed to understand What they never understood, because they never looked closely enough to see me, is that there is a difference between someone who won't fight and someone who is choosing when. And the last thing, the one that matters most. My grandmother didn't leave me money. She left me proof. Proof that someone in this family had seen me, the real me, the one who builds things, the one who shows up early and cleans up last and makes things beautiful for people who don't always say thank you, and had decided I was worth protecting. Not with words, with documents, with plans, with the kind of love that hires a lawyer and thinks 8 years ahead and leaves a letter in a nightstand drawer for you to find when you need it most. That's the inheritance that changed my life, not the money. Not the houses, the knowledge that I had been worth the trouble all along. It's early morning now, the garden at the Holt house. The soil is damp from overnight rain. The air smells the way Oregon air smells in April, clean and green and full of the particular quiet promise that comes from things deciding to grow again after a long time of holding still. I'm on my knees in the dirt planting peonies. Sarah Bernhardt variety, the ones my grandmother always grew. Because she was dramatic, she was pink, and she lasted longer than anyone thought she would. Grandma had a sense of humor about everything, including flowers. The roots go in, the soil goes over. I press it down the way she taught me, gently, firmly, steadily. The whole root ball, nothing left behind. The sun comes over the roofline and falls across the garden in long gold bars. Somewhere in the house, my coffee is going cold. Somewhere on the other side of the city, my father is waking up in a rented apartment and telling himself a story in which he is the wronged party. Maybe someday he'll stop telling it. I've stopped needing him too. I stand up, brush the dirt from my palms, and notice something on the front porch that wasn't there last night. An envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just my name on the front in a handwriting I know almost as well as my own. Not my grandmother's, she's gone, but close, unmistakable. I open it, one page, one line. I'm sorry I stayed quiet for so long. I'm not staying quiet anymore. Mom, I fold the letter carefully. I slide it into my coat pocket right next to the other one, the cream-colored stationery with the blue ink. The one I carry with me everywhere, the one that saved my life. 2 letters, 2 women. One who planned decades ahead and one who finally caught up. I walk back inside. I close the door. For the first time in 29 years, it sounds exactly like what it is. Home. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story made you feel something, if you recognized something in it, if it made you angry or relieved or a little less alone, then it did exactly what I needed it to do. If it resonated with you, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And check the description, there's another story down there that I think you might need to hear. I'm Cassidy Holt, and that was the last time I ever sat at the wrong table.